And so it's actually been used a lot of times because we have the initial location of where people were at the start of the fire, who they came with, who they met up while they were there, and the outcomes. We know who survived, who was injured, the extent of their injuries, and we also know not only who died, but where they died. The complete data set was compiled by Manuel Torres, Kim Gill, and then others at the DRC, and it was restricted just to the Disaster Research Center until 2011. It's been made available since then, and then we actually expanded the data set a little bit in that I met up with someone who worked at the radio station that had people there for the concert, and was able to find out more about the interns who had been lost in the fire. That hadn't been initially reported because they were all underage.
Shouldn't have been in the club the first day.
Yeah. And so a lot of other studies provided kind of a scope for like how other people had approached it, and the basis for kind of a ballpark for the numbers I was looking for, and the types of errors that were made.
Errors in decision making, or
errors in decision making and kind of approach. And also, this data set is all going to be available through University of Michigan's
ICPSR?
Yes. My advisor is sending the data out, I think, this week. So it is all going to be available widely in addition to the stripped down data set that is available with my simulation, because I have everything anonymized. So the different heads and models, there are several different approaches to evacuation models. My favorite are the ones that use fluid dynamics as a model of crowd behavior. It's great, because we all, of course, flow together like fluids. There are also cellular automata models, which provide a kind of mechanical idea of how people move. Agent-based modeling is the one that I went with and was most excited about because it allows for the incorporation of social factors, and it's dynamic, and you can use individual motivation, which was really important because a lot of what confused people who were initially modeling this was the discrepancies between rational behavior and what was observed. And there are actually several agent-based models that are based and then one of the more recent scholars, Feng, classified them into either pattern-based or force-based. So the force-based models, people act kind of like they're in a magnetic field. They're attracted to and repelled by things like fire and other people. And then there are the pattern-based models that tend to have like strict behavioral patterns that once someone has gone into the behavioral pattern of they're going to exit, they follow that pattern. So I used group loyalty as kind of the most important thing I was looking at. So I ended up making it priority-based, so that people have individual preferences and priorities. I also used A-star pathfinding, but not to influence the direction, just to influence how people got to their priorities once they had decided on those priorities. And it builds on prior work. One of the more recent papers was Eric Best, and he looked at small group leadership. And his major finding was that as people move in and out of groups that are trying to work together to get to an exit, that different people will take on leadership roles, but the single biggest factor in who was a leader was who had already been a leader. So like if two smaller groups met up and became a larger group, the larger group would have a different leader, but it would be most likely to be one of the previous leaders. And then Bang looked at proxemics, so that people don't just not walk into each other, but they prefer to have some social distance even when they're cooperating to evacuate. And then this is the result. This is one run of the model. Let's see if I can make that work. nothing happens for the first 30 seconds, which I'm just going to talk to because this is actually something that's really exciting to me. So at 0 seconds, that's when the pyrotechnics started. But people didn't realize it was a problem right away because they expected some degree of fire. And so initially they didn't react as if it were a problem. And it took a while for them to notice. It took 24 seconds for the band to stop playing. And then people moved and started to their evacuation behaviors. The color coding is based on different types of groups. Basically, the warmer the color temperature, the more intimate the group. And then there's a lot of grouping because people move towards their group members rather than initially moving towards the exit. The fire initially spread slowly, and there was a fair amount of smoke. A lot of the major injuries were from smoke inhalation rather than necessarily burns.
Can you identify the exits that we're looking at?
So the main exit is the one with the nice big line of people. This is the stage exit that people were initially turned away from because the bouncer said that was only for the band. This is the bar exit, which most people knew about because they had at some point in their night at the nightclub gone to the bar. This is the kitchen exit, which a lot of people didn't know about because it was staff only. And this is a broken window, and we are just about to see another broken window. The broken windows in the model just break at the time that the National Institute of Standards and Technologies report says that they broke, because I wanted to be able to focus on the group dynamics rather than the forces that would go into making someone break a window.
So just to be clear, I think so what we've just seen is the data you have about what actually happened. Is that right?
This is a run of the model. It's not precisely accurate. There, for example, weren't people trapped in the bathroom. As you can see at the top there, that is the men's room. But this is a model run showing the number of people dead, and then also the links between people. Their social ties, because part of what I was looking at was when those social ties break down.
Are the data rich enough for you to construct the historical trajectory of all the people?
No. I actually have another data set that I've started to work on that the Beverly Hills Supper Club, people actually drew maps of the path they took to get out of the building. And so right now I have boxes of surveys and maps, but once I have that computer readable, that's going to be a really rich data source for showing exactly how people moved and let me validate the model again and see how generalizable it is.
So maybe can you summarize quickly kind of what kind of data you have then? You have data about the aggregates. You have data on obviously names and other kinds of things that you anonymize.
Yes.
What kind of data do you have on individuals during the event?
During the event, not a lot. This went in real time. This model run is real time. The entire thing was over and under 180 seconds, so there's not a lot of nuances of behavior that were reported. A couple people talked about that they tried to find their friends, or who broke the window when, but this doesn't reflect that because it happened so quickly.
So were there anything like, were there any trampling injuries or trampling deaths or those kinds of things?
There were 2 crushing injuries, 2 crushing deaths, and they happened here, where there's the really narrow bottleneck turning into the main entrance. It's actually slightly narrower than that because coat check is in the top corner too. And so people trying to get out just ended up compressed. And so to talk about how it does work, from the initial setup, I have people are alive at the beginning. That is one of the fundamental setup components. Health is a variable, but it was set up using data about the individuals, but it's not highly variable. One of the things that makes this so popular to model is that it's a really homogeneous population. Everyone was white, median age was 35, they were all from the same small town or the surrounding area. They primarily had the same kinds of jobs. There weren't like parent-child family groups. There was no one very young, no one very old, no one disabled. So it's easy. And then visibility is another of the starting conditions. Visibility was considered perfect in a cone of 180 degrees for 10 meters. And that was sort of to average the different heights of people. So some people would be able to see fairly far over a crowd, some people would not be able to see past the person in front of them. And then people are loyal to the groups they came with. We didn't differentiate by anyone they met up with there, because this did happen fairly early in the evening. And then the degree of loyalty varies. So once the concert starts, fire and smoke were both immediate, but then increased over time. And then as smoke increases, visibility decreases. Fire and smoke both decrease health and cause injury. Smoke has a bigger impact on health than fire does, partly because in people's preferred paths, they avoid fire as much as possible. The general heuristic for that is that they want to get where they're going as quickly as possible on a path that's less on fire. And then if health reaches 0, then people die. But then loyalty, as smoke and fire increase, the loyalty is considered put under pressure, so that people's impression of danger can overwhelm their loyalty, and so sometimes they will leave their groups and try and exit as if they were individuals. And the group loyalty and pathfinding lead people to, once they decide on a goal, they then use A-star pathfinding algorithm, which is one of the more common pathfinding algorithms because it looks for the shortest route that also fulfills the best conditions of a heuristic. So it's not as computationally expensive as algorithms that consider all options, which ends up being important because of the way I initially set it up. It's 36,000 patches, which is ridiculously huge and takes 18 hours to run. And then once they reach an exit, if they reach an exit, then they can exit successfully. So, how do they decide on a goal? First, they need to become alarmed. You saw in the video that initially they don't necessarily. And how I did that was looking at people need to see a certain number of factors in order to become alarmed, and those factors can be either fire or smoke or other people being alarmed. And I found that that combination most closely mimicked what actually happened. And then once they are alarmed, do they have group members they care about? If yes, then what they do next is look for their closest group member. 2 meters is considered roughly conversational distance, like we could work together to exit the building. we couldn't necessarily, especially if there were people between us. And then if they're not within 2 meters, or if you have someone you are looking for more people, then you act as a group. And then the leader-follower model for that is I used Eric Best's, once someone became a leader, they were likely to continue to be a leader. But we also looked at people who had been to the nightclub before, were more likely to be leaders, with the expectation that they would be more likely to be expected to know where the exits are. And then we also ended up using male gender as an indicator of leadership, largely in absence of more nuanced indicators. And then basically, if you're the leader, then you move on to try and collect all of your friends. You've got to catch them all before you leave the building. Once you have everyone, or have given up on them because they have already died, then if you had been to the nightclub before, or this is also where you go immediately acting as an individual, you're expected to know where all of the exits are, and then go to the best exit. If not, then people would know where any exit they had seen was, and where the main exit was. And the main exit was taken as known because it was where everyone had to come in. It was a ticketed event, so there was no one coming inside doors. So we figured reasonably they could be expected to know where they came in. And then they go to the best exit and they know about. So defining best. The first part of that is the closest exit. But then there were complicating factors, like there is the growing threat of the fire, there was the bouncer, there was the smoke, and then there was also crowding around the exits as people tried to get out. And so it was a matter of trying to find the least crowded, least smoky, least on fire exit that was closest to you. And so that ended up being computed mathematically, and then people aimed for that one. And then this is only a sample of the current published models. There are actually 28 right now. They just would not all fit on a slide. So at the top are the actual results of the fire. So 78 people went out the bar exit, 71 out the window that broke, and then a fair number of people used the sunroom window that broke. Only 17 people used the kitchen exit, which was somewhat expected because it was employees only, and so people generally would have been expected to know about it less. And then the majority of people who could use the main exit, and then eventually the bouncer was convinced that there was a problem, and so 24 people ended up using the stage exit, and then 100 died. We know the individual outcomes for 452 of the 465 people there. The others are just a gap. And then the really interesting thing for me is that these are all models that do not include social factors. This one is a fluid dynamics model, and the other ones use different approaches, but they don't include the social variables. The later ones that are more accurate did include social dynamics, which was really great as a comparison to show how valuable it is as an approach in general. And then mine, I ended up with reasonably accurate results, though for me a really interesting thing was how many fewer people used the kitchen exit, because that points a lot to possibly employers were pointing people towards that exit, and so communication even within that very rapid evacuation. And then because there are so many different factors, the exits, the injuries, the number of dead, I ended up looking at total differentials to be able to look at all of them without favoring one particular metric. So overall differentials, as you can see, once they start incorporating social factors, those differentials dip dramatically. but including group loyalty as the, that's not supposed to have a minus sign there, ignore the minus sign, on the blue one. But including group loyalty made it a lot more accurate. And then the squared differences highlights if any particular metric is really out of whack. And so if there's any one area where something is dramatically wrong. So I looked at that as well and it came out pretty well. Here's some descriptive statistics of my results. A fair amount in terms of standard deviation, except again for the kitchen exit, which is something I'm going to explore more going forward.
So tell us how you, this is the mean over what kinds of variations did you do from run to run? Did you change the initial conditions of the agents, or?
Oh, no, this is because it's not deterministic, it's a probabilistic model, so it would be people making different decisions interacting with the crowd. Because the fire and the smoke are the same every time, so this is just a matter of the agents behaving differently.
So in essence, you just change the seed then?
And their initial placement was the same in every run as well.
And do you have data on initial placement or not?
Yes, well we have, we separated into sub-ecologies because there were different areas like the dance floor, the main bar, and people identified if they were in like the sunroom or behind the bar. And so we placed people within those sub-ecologies, but like people who were on the dance floor area were randomized within that area. So that we got, so we weren't relying on people being 100% accurate in the relating the data, with the exception of the bartenders who were behind the bars where they were supposed to be.
So the randomized, so basically, so that changes them from run to run on this?
No, they were randomized once and then that was used as an external input. I set it up as much as possible so that it can be changed between different scenarios. So the people, the fire, the smoke, and the built environment are all read in from CSVs. So just throw up a bunch of numbers and the so what. It's a new simulation framework. It uses the priorities as a baseline rather than being strictly force-based, which I think allows more nuance in exploration. And its validation using the station data was really important because a fair number of models aren't validated at all, particularly evacuation models, and that makes them less useful in terms of building better buildings that can be evacuated more safely. Though in this one it wouldn't necessarily have helped because the guidelines were nowhere near to followed in any respect. Because of the egg crate packing foam and the more than 100 more people than should have been there. So I'm again going forward working with the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire, which is also a nightclub fire in the continental United States before smartphones were ubiquitous, which provides as similar an environment as possible. So I'll be able to tell if any like massive gaps, they're like going to be a flaw in the model rather than a difference in circumstance. And also the overarching project I'm on is interdependencies and community resilience, which is primarily out of the University of Michigan. And they're building an all-hazard model. Primarily they're focused on built environments and like how hurricanes impact buildings and how earthquakes impact cities. And so I'm working on having it so they can actually have people interact with those environments. That's been an adventure so far because we're working at very different granularities. But we're making progress. They can now import people from this program. It's very exciting now. I just need to be able to import things from their programs. And then I'm also going to be looking at multiple hazards if possible. Once I have the fire segment generalizable, because it's just really interesting to me, but also because fire happens so much more quickly than a lot of hazards. Like this was over in 3 minutes. The Beverly Hills Supper Club evacuation was over in under half an hour. Everything happens really quickly, whereas something like hurricane evacuation takes place over the course of days, and usually before the hazard hits. And so looking at the differences in behaviors and whether we can understand them in the same ways is a really exciting project for me. Questions? Ended up going through that a lot faster than I expected. Yes.
Why did you choose NetLogo?
I inherited the built environment, and I didn't know a lot about interface modeling when I started. So I ended up using it initially just because it was there, but I've grown really fond of it. It works really well in terms of you can start really simply and you can build a lot of really simple stuff, but it accepts building ridiculously complicated environments and will run a star over 30,000 patches if you tell it to. Just won't do it quickly.
In your consideration of multiple hazards, it seems like we're confronted more and more by the active shooter kind of events. Have you thought of looking at that kind of an event that you could model?
I have, and that one, it's actually a quandary for me, because I've made this free and open source, including having the anonymized data set online. I'm concerned that if I include an active shooter component, that would then also be available online for potential active shooters to see how people would act. And so I'm really torn about that, because I want to be able to build something that's useful, especially because it is such a growing concern. And it's also a project of someone at the Disaster Research Center, so I would be able to work with people who are like getting really good data. But I think I would have to make it a component that wouldn't be part of the main release.
My thought was that we unfortunately a lot of that available.
Yeah.
Is there any component to this where people will go back in because maybe they're like, oh, my sister didn't come out, let me go back and find her? And then if not, is that a part of the larger fire?
There isn't in this one, so it's actually something I'm going to have to include because it is specifically something that happened at Beverly Hills Supper Club fire. One of the maps I have shows the route they took to get out, and then the route this was a couple, and then he was a doctor, and so he went back in to help people.
And the busboy kept going back in.
Yep.
And dragging people out.
Yeah, and so it's going to be something to incorporate. It's not something I have yet. It's just something that's currently people leave the model as soon as they're out of the building because that reduces the computation time. So I'm going to have to change that, but I'm also going to, now that I am used to NetLogo and more accustomed to programming environments, I'm going to dramatically decrease the size of what I'm working with because I think that behavior component and people's interaction with their environment will stay the same even if it's running with less granularity.
So then, I guess in the broader context of what you're researching, is that incorporated in other people's works? Do they capture that aspect or go back in, or is that not really?
Not that I've seen. Part of it is I haven't seen a lot on the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire that approaches it from the modeling perspective, and some of that is because the really high quality survey data, like there are surveys that people, they wrote on the back, they wrote their home addresses and their phone numbers and their office numbers and their office fax numbers, only in a couple of cases, but because that was collected by mostly by Norris Johnson, who then left that data to the DRC, and so it's just been sitting in boxes. So not a lot of people who've used it, and there's a couple of really basic computer readable files with the data from it, but it doesn't have any of that richness or any of the really cool social factors.
Thank you.
So you have this really great baseline that's fully validated with, this specific rock band scenario. So I'm wondering, how many groups were in there for this that were validated? So we had out of 450 people, there were 40 groups.
No, it was.
10, 15
I know. It's a web. So
I'm pretty sure it's 160.
okay. Have you looked at now varying the groups and the group dynamics to see if that changed the outcomes of how many people got out and how many people were injured?
Yeah, I've looked primarily at varying group loyalty. So the way we have it set up is, so there are different group types. There are coworkers, friends of dating, and then people who are family, including spouses, and then people with multiple kinds of relationships. The assumption, and this is always a terrible thing to bring up with coworker groups, is that people don't care about their coworkers as much as their friends. And even worse to bring up in a coworker group, we found that's fairly accurate. And varying the loyalty, so it increases with kind of perceived intimacy, has worked really well. With everyone having more loyalty, that generally increases the number of dead, and decreases the number of people who are able to evacuate. With lower loyalty, those group ties break down more quickly. But it's also really interesting because depending on how high the loyalty is, the time period in which people's loyalty breaks down is important. And this is relatively newer data, so I don't have a lot of numbers for it. But people who stick with their initial group versus people who get partway through prioritizing a group and then abruptly change their priorities without having fully pursued that goal. Changing your mind midway doesn't look like it's actually an advantage. And it does, you still get the decrease in the number of survivors, but not as much as with the really high loyalty. And then there's some interesting new stuff coming out with medium loyalty may actually be the worst scenario. But I don't have a sample size I'm happy with about that.
How about rate of movement? Did you have everybody at the same speed? Was it traffic based?
It was traffic based. So people had, we initially tried it with people went at different walking speeds, but people moved way too quickly, which was interesting. So I then set it up with people have different maximum walking speeds, but they start out, initially they're all standing still, and then they try to accelerate, and the acceleration is constant, but people still end up going fairly slowly because of the density of traffic. If there are 100 fewer people in the building, everyone survives. It's always very exciting. This research has made it so I now check occupancy limits on rooms.
What's ours?
I have no idea, but I can see exit signs, so I'm okay.
What was the occupancy limit for this one?
It had been revised several times. It was a small town. There was one fire marshal. He was friends with people. He revised things. He revised numbers up consistently. One of the more recent numbers was 317. That had been raised more recently, but 317 had been the initial high number that he had quoted them if they took out all of the tables. they did not take out all of the tables. So I think that with the number of tables that were in the building, in earlier incarnations of the maximum recommended occupancy limit, it had been more like 250.
In your model, when you tested numbers, what occupancy level got everybody out alive? So 200?
Up to about 300 did. I didn't do a lot of extensive testing with that. But if everyone moves quickly and there are fewer than 400 people, it tends to go significantly better. And some of that's just with the way people are able to accelerate.
Building off one of the earlier questions about walking speed, is I guess athleticism consideration? Because let's just say this was a movie theater, senior day versus a typical Friday is going to have very different levels of athleticism.
Yeah, I was actually really worried about that because it also doesn't account for mobility issues. But no one ends up anywhere near their maximum walking speed. The model as it is doesn't incorporate athleticism or any other factors into maximum walking speed. It was just randomized. But no one ends up even anywhere close to it. The maximum walking speed individually varies between 1.1 meters per second and 1.5 meters per second. People in the model generally topped out closer to the end of the evacuation at about half a meter a second, which was really interesting, but also somewhat disheartening because if they had more room to move, they would have been able to.
I guess what I'm really trying to get at is if you're trying to provide this as a generalized solution to fire safety, and your data was based on your model was based on data that was all around, all white, all 30 years old around. That I guess I'm getting at. Is there a way that you're thinking about approaching that factor when this is going to go out to California Fire Safety Department, and they're like, okay, well, how does this work in a movie theater for the elderly or something like that?
Yeah, that's part of the reason that I'm so excited about working with Beverly Hills Soccer Club data.
Got it. Okay.
Because there were also family groups. I haven't encountered anything about potential mobility issues yet. I've just started diving into boxes of stuff. But it has different dynamics, it has different demographics, and so different levels of cooperation.
Yeah.
Because interethnic cooperation is sometimes, statistically it is sometimes an issue. But it's going to really help with looking at how all of these factors beyond a really homogeneous group interact.
But it also has a longer time period, and people had different roles, and they stayed in their roles.
Yep.
So customers waited and died at their seats, while the busboy had the information, provided it, and they didn't leave it.
Yeah. No. They actually, apparently a number of people thought the warning to evacuate was part of the comedy act they were there for. So, which, again, there's really interesting things in how people become alarmed.
Right.
So I'm actually really glad I started with this data set and now I'm moving on to the Beverly Hills Soccer Club data set.
This one's well defined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it adds in more complexities, but I'm going to be able to more clearly see what's a matter of differences in the situation itself, and what's a matter of modeling is hard and scary.
Question over there.
Can you talk about danger sensitivity?
Yes. So I was playing around with how close something has to be before people become alarmed, and specifically what discourages them from exits. So this is looking at how many meters around an exit there has to be a crowd and smoke and fire for people to be discouraged by it. Through testing, this is what I ended up with, because it tends to work fairly well.
In other words, it gave you results that was closest to the actual real-world results?
Yeah.
Okay.
Turning it down ends up with a lot more people using the stage exit. which was fully engulfed in flames. And so that didn't seem particularly. I wanted something that was validated and that reflected what actually happened, but I also was trying to look for where it departed from the data that it still made sense internally for those agents. And so if it was a lot more people use one of the other exits that's less on fire, that would have been like, okay, that's weird, but I continued testing it because using the exit that was fully engulfed in flames didn't make sense to me internally.
So tell us more, I think, about how you adjusted the parameters as you just talked about. So you showed us about half a dozen output measures, including then the squared one that you compared the model to. And then how many parameters would you say, and you're showing another kind of half a dozen here, are there other parameters that are basically embedded in the model somewhere? Or?
So there's the walking speed, there's...
And is that homogeneous or heterogeneous?
Heterogeneous.
So there's how many parameters to specify?
That...
Mean variance kind of thing?
It was, they all have a set, I was looking at different studies people had done and kind of what they had found in terms of average walking speed in a crowd. And then it's randomized. Everyone has 1 meter a second plus between 0.1 and 0.4 meters per second, so that there would be a spread and so that it would have traffic interactions. And then there's the health variable, which was done by a previous researcher looking at it, looking at factors like age, gender, prior health concerns, and then some randomization. And then there's...
So there's a handful of those, and there's a handful here. So it's on the order of like some dozen things that would be adjusted to fit something on the order of like half a dozen outputs. Is that kind of where the overall thing works?
No, the only thing that was, once I had something that worked, then it was a matter of like people would exit in a predictable way. They wouldn't half a meter from the main exit decide that the best exit was the bar exit. Once I had it internally consistent, then it was primarily a matter of looking at group loyalty. And so this was the only thing that I really played around with. The danger sensitivity was essentially part of fine-tuning it once I had recognized some of the crowd factors at play, and the exit crowding. And I really wanted to see like how much that changed, but I also didn't want to have to like go and encode it every time.
The red dots are the fire, right?
Yes, the red squares are fire.
How did, so I see how the fire spread from the stage, and then there's this huge gap of black between, I guess, the kitchen area?
Yes.
How did the fire get there?
So there was Flashover. So there are a couple of different like layers of the fire. Initially it was taken at head height, roughly 1.6 meters from the ground. We took a cross slice and looked at anything above 200 degrees Celsius at that height was considered to be on fire.
Okay.
But there was also a flashover, so the ceiling was on fire.
Okay.
And then later, I think after 120 seconds, the slice we looked at was at 0.8 meters off the ground, with the idea that generally then most people would be crawling because of the degree of smoke. So this is what would be on fire at the level that people generally were. The ceiling was also on fire.
Yeah, okay, so then it's very possible that the fire crept over the ceiling and then got to a human level, if you will.
No, there was a significant fire on the ceiling because the paint on the ceiling was also highly flammable.
Not to build it. Yeah.
Everything that could go wrong in the actual like physical construction of this environment basically did go wrong because of people who didn't want to pay to do it right.
So when you make several model runs, every time the behavior is slightly different. Is the spread of the fire different from run to run?
No. The fire is all read in from a CSV. We got that data from NIST's extensive modeling of it because they do a granularity of like nanometers. So we just took slices from that and turned it into a CSV that could be read in easily.
And you mentioned also that presumably the smoke modifies health.
Yes.
Does then reduced health modify behavior? Not presumably modify the walking speed?
No. But with injury, people who are moderately injured are then less likely to be leaders.
What were the what were the actual demographics of the deaths?
They were a spread because most of the deaths were caused by smoke inhalation, and so
no major difference between male, female, ages, etc.
No.
Or locations?
Locations, it was more on the dance floor.
Okay.
Because that was closer to the start of the fire and farther to evacuate. And so the casualties themselves, the initial demographics, there were a lot more women close to the stage on the dance floor and more men at the bar. And so the casualties reflect that to some extent, but you can't parse out the...
Right.
But you could probably compare your model output to that, couldn't you? Could you compare your model output to the demographic characteristics to what actually happened?
Yes, theoretically.
And then when it comes to that
Your
model
agent
actual
says
behavior, have you ever there is a literature, I guess it's called something like, you're basically using the whole A-star thing is basically decision theory, right?
Yeah.
So you decide how to do. Now there is a literature called behavioral decision theory, which is basically people are quite imperfect in how they make decisions. And I'm thinking, and this is like Baruch Fischoff and Paul Slovic, these guys, they're all students of Kahn University. Now, within that literature, there is a further sub-area called aroused decision making. And people are in some aroused state, which would be, say, fear or sexual or otherwise, how decision making degrades. And there's pretty good data on that. They have, there's a largish literature on this kind of aroused decision making. And I wonder if that's something which you might use to, in essence, that would help you get away from the more rational A-star thing. And it would, for example, I think one of the things that arises there is looking at things like, people may be willing to wait in line if they know they're going to get out, but as soon as they realize that they might not get out, then they're not willing to wait anymore. Then maybe the trampling stuff can happen. All that kind of stuff. Right?
There's not a lot of that. Like a lot of the classic ideas of really antisocial crowd behavior in an emergency are consistently shown to be myths. We have a whole literature in disasters about panic and how much we hate it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of it, like the trampling and the crushing, were because people were all moving forward, and the people behind who were still like encouraging the people in front of them to move forward didn't know about like the narrow confines, and so the crushing injuries were a matter of crowd interaction rather than antisocial behavior.
Because I think that in this behavioral decision theory stuff, in the aroused decision making, the usual story is that all behavior is a trade-off between exploration and exploitation. You know what you got to do, but occasionally you're willing to explore. And then what happens in an aroused state is you're not willing to explore very much anymore. And so it's all exploit. And that's what makes it a little bit more maniacal. But the result, the things I mentioned, the papers by Slovic and Fischoff, those are empirical papers. Papers about the empirics of having American college students in aroused states of some kind.
Yeah. Slovic did the tunnel full of smoke, right?
Exactly, that's right.
Yeah, no, I read some of that, and a lot of it was people go towards the familiar, which we had, and then there's also Syme, who wrote a bunch of stuff in the 80s about the Who concert stampede, and then also about affiliative behavior in evacuation. And basically people go towards things and people they know and like. And so that was a component of the prioritizing of the people that came with.
Because it strikes me that the A-star behavior is kind of deeply, how do I say it, it's kind of, it's individually rational, it's not social.
Oh, no,
right.
People don't use A-star to decide on their priorities. It's not like, okay, I have a friend, or here's, or over there and an exit over here. A star says that the exit is closer. They have their priorities and they pursue their priorities, but A star is how they move mechanically through the world. Like if the option is, because I needed a way for them to find a way through the building. And some of it is like, if someone was going through this exit, some pathfinding algorithms would have them go along here and then down here and then around here, and like tracing the walls. But A star would put people in the more.
But A star is also going to put everybody, like you show it, following exactly the same path.
Same path.
Yeah.
Rather than being side by side or 3 across or something else. They're going to have more traffic because they're all in the exact one person wide path.
Yeah, actually, over here you end up seeing more of the crowding effects. But no, here
But they're starting
they
from
are
different places
queuing.
and it's open.
It was actually fairly narrow. There is not actually room for 3 people across. There is enough room for 2 people to fit there, but they also, people prefer not to be next to walls, like, and so that is a component of the heuristic, and so it ended up reinforcing just the queuing behavior.
Any more questions? Well, thank Eileen again.
Yes.